Tonight, we are happy to be presenting live through our Islamic Center of San Diego Facebook channel and YouTube channel a special program that we've entitled Heart to Heart, Nourishing Our Marriages and Interpersonal Relationships in Times of Stress. I'm honored to be with you tonight. My name is Marwa Abdullah. I'm a San Diego-based researcher and community educator that specializes in the diverse experiences of American Muslim families. I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation, and I wanted to make note of the fact that a lot of different organizations have focused on issues related to marriage and family, and I think we are really indebted to our different faith communities and our Muslim communities throughout the United States for helping us, because all of us are facing an unprecedented experience right now. We've never really had anything like this happen in our lifetimes, and we need to know what kind of tools we are equipped with to keep our marriages and families healthy. So I want to start by asking us to think about what a healthy marriage looks like. Can you think of an example of a healthy marriage? Maybe you might think of we might think of our own marriages. We might think of marriages of those of people whom we are close to. We might even draw on history and look at, in our own tradition or in other traditions, examples of marriages that we characterized as strong and healthy. If we look at those, we'll probably notice some common characteristics. But before I get into those common characteristics, let's talk for a minute about what a healthy marriage is not. Now, a healthy marriage is not one that never has any problems. A healthy marriage is not one where spouses go around with smiles plastered to their faces, robotically engaging in the exact same routine activities day in and day out. A healthy marriage is also not one in which spouses are exactly the same the day that they enter that marriage as they are 1 year into the marriage, or 5 years into the marriage, or 10, or 15, 25, or 50 years into that marriage. Healthy marriages are ones that allow for change. They allow for growth. They're also ones in which spouses feel that they can be their authentic selves, where they feel that they are heard by their spouse, where they feel that they can reach their fullest potential. And from an Islamic framework, perhaps the most important sign of a healthy marriage is that it is one that serves as a means for us to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimately, everything that we are given in life is a means to a greater end. It is a means by which we grow as people, by which we grow in our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by which we grow as individuals who can be of service to those around them. So looking at marriage as a means to that end is very important. So if marriage is a source of comfort and support and growth, it's important to know that we have to take care of our marriages. And during times of stress, during times of difficulty, it becomes even more important that we understand how to nourish those relationships, how to nourish our marriages. I've spoken on the topic of marriage in front of a lot of diverse audiences, and I often like to use metaphors to help us sort of understand some of the concepts that are areas of research that focus on interpersonal relationships and marriages. One of my favorite metaphors for talking about marriage is to talk about it as if it were a garden. Now, to begin with, a garden, by definition, is sort of a curated, cultivated collection of plants. And different plants and different types of gardens have different needs. So no two marriages are exactly alike. There are some marriages that require more of some things than others. Some plants, for example, are very drought resistant. Other plants are very sensitive. Other plants require a certain composition in the soil.
So keep in mind that we can't look at any one marriage and think, well, why isn't my marriage that way? We can't watch, a performance of marriage in a movie or on a regular television show and think, well, isn't our relationship like that? First of all, you know, actors portray marriage very differently than marriage occurs in real life. And second of all, no two marriages are ever exactly the same. So given that, what are some things that we could generalize about gardens and about marriages that are really necessary for their health, for their nourishment, for their growth? When I talk about marriage as a garden, I often talk about gardens needing three things, at a very fundamental level. They need sunlight, they need water, and they need soil. And there are other things that can beautify a garden, but without those, the plants in that garden are probably not going to do very well. They're definitely not going to reach their fullest potential. And when you think about a garden, you realize, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends rain down from the sky, but there might be periods of drought when the person taking care of that garden has to do the difficult task of watering the plants, him or herself. A lot of plants have natural resistance to certain types of pests and bugs, but there may be a season when a certain pest comes into a garden and the gardener, him or herself, has to take care of those plants in a much more, intimate sort of way and really, be able to remove the pests from the garden or find a way to keep them off the plants. And there may be a year when a specific kind of weed threatens to choke the plants in the garden. And again, the gardener has to be vigilant, has to be on the outlook for anything that might threaten the health of that garden. And I think that if we look at what's happening now with the stresses of COVID-19, there's a lack of personal, emotional space. There's a lack of physical space in many households. You have multiple generations often living together, and that can compound the feeling that one doesn't have enough space. There are some families that are dealing with financial concerns, and that can be a real stress on any marriage. And there's also the added stress of work schedules, and if people have young children or school-age children, the added stress of having to make sure that those responsibilities, those school responsibilities, are kept up. So I think that for all of us, a very good sort of first step is to say, it's okay if we're dealing with stress in our families or in our marriages, because this is a situation that is not like every other season of life. Our gardens are going to need some extra care. But alhamdulillah, the good news is that it is within our capability to take care of our gardens at this time. And with that, I actually wanted to share my screen and share some slides that will help us understand a little bit more about this garden metaphor and understand a little bit better how we can nourish our marriages in times of stress. So I will get my screen up on the slides. And this is a beautiful garden. This garden is actually located in Victoria, Canada, just outside of Vancouver. And the minute you walk into this garden, you realize that the people taking care of this garden care very deeply about what they're doing. Everything is in order. The colors are meticulously chosen. The plants are laid out in beautiful patterns, and it's a place that is very calming to the soul. Now, like I said, regardless of what our garden contains, regardless of the different needs of the various plants, in general, a garden needs sunlight, it needs water, and it needs soil. There are other things that we can add to make our gardens even healthier and more beautiful, but those really are the three that are absolutely necessary. So how do those correlate to our marriages? Well, some things are absolutely necessary for our marriages to flourish as well. And if we think about what sunlight might be in reference to our marriages, I like to explain that the sunlight is like the divine light and the guidance that we find in the teachings of Islam. in the Quran, in the Sunnah. The light that helps our marriages is that light that strengthens our spiritual health and our spiritual connection with our spouse. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about this because my background is in communication. I've looked quite a lot at family communication, and there are many, many studies that look at the concept of marital satisfaction. And these studies will use measures of marital satisfaction to try to understand how happy people are in their marriages. And I don't want to get too complicated, but I'd like to explain some of what this research has shown because it's really quite fascinating. Researchers have looked at variables such as religion or religiosity and spirituality. Religiosity is how often a person engages in religious rituals. So in our Muslim tradition, that might be how often does a person engage in rituals like prayer, like fasting, like the reading or recitation of Quran, like dhikr or remembrance, attendance at the masjid, involvement in different religious community events. So that might be a measure of religiosity. Spirituality would be how connected does a person feel to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How connected does a person feel to God? How much does that person feel that God is involved in the happenings of their life? How close do they feel to God, and how often do they feel they can turn to God with their concerns or grievances, or to ask for help? So the religion and spirituality of the individual is something that researchers have surveys and scales and different ways of assessing. There's another variable called individual relationship with God. And again, this tests or measures how close a person feels they are to God. What does their individual relationship with God look like in terms of supplicating, praying, asking for help? Interestingly, these are both individual level variables, and neither of them have a strong correlation with marital satisfaction. So what does that mean? It means that in a marriage, one spouse or the other might consider themselves very religious or very spiritual, or have a very close individual relationship with God, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What the research shows is that that may be of great benefit to the individual, but it may not result in them feeling they are satisfied in their marriage. However, there are other measures that show a very strong correlation with marital satisfaction. One of those is called joint religious communication. And this variable looks at how often is it that spouses talk together, communicate about those things that they value in their religiosity, in their spirituality. How often do they talk about what they're learning in their faith? How often do they bring concepts related to their connectedness to God into their communication with one another? And then fascinating study that was done on Muslim Americans, and specifically the African American Muslim community in the United States, that looked again at multiple variables and found that the one variable that had the closest correlation to marital satisfaction, or was the strongest predictor of marital satisfaction, was praying salah together. And this specific dissertation that was done, mashallah, the participants in this research, 70% of the participants prayed 5 times a day. So the majority of participants prayed regularly. They were of those who they would hafidu ala salawatihim. They were very careful in taking care of their prayers. But less than half of the participants said they prayed with their spouse at least once a week in congregation. So a very, very small number were praying regularly salah together. But those who prayed salah together, that was one of the strongest predictors of them having this higher level of marital satisfaction. And we have to ask why that is, subhanAllah. One of the reasons is because when we engage in religious or spiritual act together, when we have a spiritual engagement with our spouse, that is a very deep and profound connection. When we communicate about matters that are important to us, such as religion, we are able to share a part of ourselves with our spouse that is really, subhanAllah, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a bond that is strengthened not just for the sake of one another, but it is a bond that is strengthened through our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that doesn't even take into account the kind of barakah that we know is given to people who encourage one another in good, and who discourage one another from evil. So we know in our Islamic tradition, in our teachings, that there's much barakah, there's much benefit and reward for doing that within the context of marriage. The Prophet, peace be upon him, told us that marriage is half of our deen, because it is through that relationship that we learn so much, not only about ourselves, but about our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ability to forgive, the ability to serve another, the ability to sacrifice, the ability to make a commitment to someone for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of these, these research variables and these concepts, they come together with our tradition and show us that engaging at a spiritual level with our spouses is a source of nur in our relationships. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nur that Allah is the light. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. And Allah tells us in the same verse that He guides to His light the one that wills to be guided. When we turn toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our marriages and make a commitment to strengthen our marriages through our love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we are seeking and bringing in that divine light to our marriages. And again, it's not something for a plant. Sunlight isn't optional. It's a necessary part of the process by which that plant keeps itself alive and nourishes not only itself, but nourishes others. Through photosynthesis, plants make food that they're able to then share with the rest of the created world. And so when we let that light into our marriages, we benefit our marriage and we make our marriage a source of good for those around it. The Quran also has been talked about, it talks about itself, subhanAllah. Allah tells us in the Quran that there has come to you instruction from your Lord, referring specifically to the Quran, and a healing for what is in the chests or the breasts, and a guidance and mercy for the believers. So again, when we bring in the connection at the level of our spirituality, but we also bring in an engagement with the Quran, when we make that a part of our marriages, it becomes a healing and a guidance for us. So we have to ask ourselves, what are some ways that we can increase the amount of nur, or divine light, in our marriages? And as the research shows, the concept of worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together is a very important one. Encouraging one another to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Often we may take for granted that, alhamdulillah, we're in a household where our spouse is engaging in their prayers, but are we checking in with them? Are we asking, how is your focus on, how is our focus in our prayers? How frequently are we praying on time? How often are we engaged in the remembrance of Allah? And what extra acts of worship might we be engaging in to draw closer to Allah? And that's especially important in these weeks leading up to Ramadan. We have a really sort of treasure of an opportunity in these days to prepare for the holy month of Ramadan. We should also never forget the power of dua and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us nourish our marriages with the tools and guidance of Islam, and to bless our marriages. Another thing that's often overlooked is that we gain knowledge together. And gaining knowledge is something that is incumbent upon every Muslim, but oftentimes spouses will do this. They will take these journeys of increasing in knowledge on their own. There's something very beautiful about learning with our spouse. And we have the perfect opportunity to do that right now, because many of us, even though life is very busy and there are a lot of stresses, there's also a little bit of extra time and opportunity, because so much is now offered online. We have so many virtual classes, so much that is available almost around the clock for us to access through YouTube and different platforms, that we can sit together with our spouse, even for 15 minutes a day, and increase our knowledge for the sake of Allah. We can also read Quran and books on Islam together, and we can also read and gain knowledge for Allah's sake in other areas. We can increase our knowledge on how to have a healthy and productive marriage. And inshallah, once the quarantine is over, we can physically attend classes and lectures and conferences, but until then, we have the opportunity to do so even from the comfort of our homes, inshallah. Another beautiful piece of advice is to have a small halaqah or some moments in the day where we share with our spouse, and if we have children, where we share with our children some beneficial knowledge rooted in our Islamic tradition. And of course, another source of light is just to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and show gratitude, even if the things that go well are few and far between. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that if we show gratitude, He will increase us. So to be grateful for the small bits of progress that we're able to make during this challenging time. So we talked a little bit about sunlight and the importance of bringing the nur of Islam into our marriages. This brings us to our second component, the second really vital or necessary component to keeping a garden healthy and also to keeping our marriages healthy, and that is water. And water here is symbolized by emotional and physical nourishment. And so this kind of nourishment takes many different forms, but really it is a communication with our spouse. It's a communication between spouses that meets the emotional and psychological needs of the spouse. And some of those needs are hinted at in this ayah, and this is an oft quoted ayah about marriage, and this ayah is actually really profound because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah in Surah Al-Rum. Surah Al-Rum is a Makki surah, so that means it was revealed during a time when the Muslims were very weak and vulnerable, and when the primary audience, aside from the Muslim community, was the Quraysh. And the Quraysh at that time were really very staunchly against the idea that there was one God. They were also very staunchly against the idea that they would be brought back to life, that there would be any kind of accountability for what they were doing in their lives. And so Surah Al-Rum addresses these things. It makes an argument to its audience by drawing their attention to multiple signs in the creation. And some of these signs include the alteration of night and day. The ayat tell the audience to look at themselves and ponder how they were created, this perfect order of the human body. They talk about the ayat talk about the rain that brings life to the earth. And nestled into these really beautiful arguments that point to Allah's existence is an ayah about marriage, and about marriage being a sign that should point us or redirect us to the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this ayah says the following. It says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن آياته أن خلق لكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة. So that's the beginning of the ayah. It tells us, and among Allah's signs is this, that He created for you spouses from among yourselves. And Allah again is using the word ayah in this verse, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, and among His signs. And the word ayah literally means something that if we think about it, if we ponder on it, if we reflect on it, it will point us back to something bigger. It will point us back to Allah. So marriage is being described as an ayah, as a miracle, a miraculous sign. And that the sign is that we have been given spouses from amongst ourselves. And what is the purpose of marriage? What is the purpose of this relationship between spouses? لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, that you may find second. And the word second comes from the same root as sukun, which means to stop, to rest. And sakan also comes from the same root as home. So it's like a place where we're able to stop, where we're able to find rest, and where we're able to finally feel at home. Marriage is being described as such. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And Allah put between you mawadda, which is often translated as love. But in English, we're very limited because we only really have one word for love. But in Arabic, we have over 10 words for love. And mawadda is one of the highest forms of love. And it's a beautiful kind of love that is very gentle and compassionate. And unlike the kind of, love that, like love at, the spark of fiery, passionate love that maybe lasts for a very short amount of time but then fizzles, mawadda is a love that grows with time, and it is cultivated. It is cultivated much like a garden is cultivated. So it's a beautiful word to describe the relationship that exists between spouses. And then rahma is the other side of that relationship, because no marriage is perfect. No two people are perfect. And a marriage has to include elements of forgiveness, elements of mercy, elements of compassion and empathy. And all of that is captured in the word rahmah. And then the ayah ends with, truly there are signs in this for people who reflect. So the emotional and psychological nourishment is that kind of communication that takes place between spouses, and it may be verbal communication, but most oftentimes it is not verbal communication. It is what we are able to share with our spouses and make them understand that we care about them, and we want this space to be a space of sakan, where we find home and peace. So how can we do that? How can we make our marriages a place of sakan, especially when there's so much that can bring stress into our lives, when the storm, the metaphorical storm outside is raging in so many ways? A great piece of advice that I received from an audience member when I gave this presentation a few years ago was that whoever sees the problem and whoever has the strength should just start. And then those around you will follow. And she said, the more I do, the more I see others around me do. And I think this is really beautiful advice because it speaks to the importance of agency. Each spouse is only in control of their own actions, and they will feel very out of control if they wait for the other spouse to do something, to change, or to be the initiator of change in the marriage. And so if we can begin with ourselves, at least we can tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I am doing what I'm able to do. I have the strength, I perceive the problems, and I'm trying to fix them in a way that offers respect and offers room for my spouse to join me. What are some other ways that we can increase the emotional and psychological nourishment in our marriages? Humans have a very, very basic need to feel appreciated. And in the context of marriage, subhanAllah, I've met people who literally, they were just praying and praying and praying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bless them with a marriage that would bring them together. And when they finally got what they wanted, it was almost as if, they began to take it for granted, and they took each other for granted, and they forgot to appreciate what the best version of their spouse. That version was still there, but they didn't appreciate it as much. So that's a very important concept and a very important means of nourishing our marriages. Respect is also crucial and key. Even when we disagree, and there is much actually to disagree about right now, with all of the information, misinformation, changing information that we have related to COVID-19, spouses might not even agree on the degree of the threat. They might not even agree on what they need to be doing in response to this unprecedented situation. So even as we disagree, there needs to be respect, and we need to try to see the perspective of the other, and that can be something that we negotiate with our communication. I might not agree with you in this moment, but I respect you and I want us to be able to work through this. I don't want this to be the source of strain in our marriage. So let's talk about how we can make this work, even if we don't see eye to eye. Trust is also very important, and it must be earned and it must be communicated. And so I think for a lot of us, I think people jump into marriage not realizing how much work it takes, that really it is like a garden. You don't just throw seeds in the ground, leave them for a few years, and expect to come back with a beautiful masterpiece. Marriage takes time, it takes work, it does take sacrifice, and sometimes it can feel like, oh, I'm putting so much in, but my spouse isn't. There's a negotiation there, and there has to be a lot of communication, and there has to be that trust as well. Attention is very important. We live in a world where we're often distracted, and so it's important to never ignore the presence of our loved ones. And empathy is something that I always like to mention in the context of marriage, because I was listening to a talk yesterday, actually. The Institute for Social Policy and Understanding gave a webinar looking at some of the research that they have done on married couples in the American Muslim community. And empathy was discussed as a means by which we can look at, even if our spouse is doing something that's really bothering us or annoying us, if we can look at it from their perspective and feel empathy for why they might be acting that way, it allows us actually to pivot and go from being very annoyed or upset about a behavior or an attitude that they might have. It allows us to pivot to a point where we can maybe even show care for them because they're dealing with something that perhaps they don't know how to deal with in the best way. So empathy is often described as the ability to walk in someone else's shoes. And I think it's really important, especially during this time, that we allow ourselves the opportunity to walk in our spouse's shoes and really understand what they're feeling, not just be able to see what they're feeling, but really to share in what they are feeling. And then another means of providing emotional and psychological nourishment is to listen actively. Listen for understanding, not so that we can judge our spouse and not so that we can interrupt them and give them advice, but rather just to really listen. And to also respect when they might not want to talk about something. We need to be able to negotiate the need for space with the need for communication and active listening. So the last component that I like to talk about using this metaphor of marriage, so our metaphorical sun was the divine light that we seek from the teachings of Islam and from our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not at the individual level, although the individual level is really important, but that we also connect at the level as a couple, at this communal level or jointly, that we have this connection with Allah, the collective level. And then the water, we said, was like the metaphor for water was the emotional and psychological nourishment. And the metaphor for our soil are those physical actions that communicate love. So this is the physical connection that we have with our spouse. And subhanAllah, there is much in the Islamic tradition that speaks to this. In the Quran, spouses are described metaphorically as garments for one another. And if you think about garments, if you think about the very clothing that we wear, clothing is a source of physical comfort. It's a source of physical protection. Our clothing keeps us warm on cold days. It helps keep us cool when the weather is very hot. It can be a means of protection from the wind, from the rain, from the ice or snow, the different elements that we may have. Our clothing is also adaptable. It adapts to fit our needs. We choose clothing that we feel comfortable in and that makes us look good, that makes us feel good about ourselves. So likewise, our spouses are a source of physical comfort for us. They're a source of physical protection for us. They should bring out the best in us, help us reach our best potential, and they should be able to adapt with us to our changing needs, to our changing interests, and really support us at that physical level. And so this kind of support includes physical affection between spouses, which alhamdulillah, we know that that is an important part of Islamic teaching, but it also includes those small gestures, the gifts that we give, the small, thoughtful, if not material things, but small things that show that we care, and the actions we do that communicate love and affection. So these physical actions. In times of stress, it might seem very overwhelming to think about maintaining the nourishment that we need for our metaphorical gardens, for our marriages. It might seem like I just don't know how to do all of that. I don't know where to start. Well, do I bring in more sun? Do we need more water? Do we need more soil? Everything seems to be falling out of place. So it's important to remember that when researchers have looked at marriages and they've looked at resilience in marriage, and a couple weeks ago we talked about how to face challenges in life with resilience. Resilience in marriage is defined as the capacity for stress-related growth. So it's the capacity for our marriages, for our close interpersonal relationships, to come out of a stressful situation and actually be stronger. That is what resilience is, that we can grow. And when researchers have looked at marriages that were satisfactory for people, that were successful, that were healthy, they found that among the most important themes in these successful marriages was flexibility. The ability to change my routine when needed. I love, in one of the seminars that was recently given about marriage, one of the concepts that was discussed was that your perception may not always be what's right. Your preference may not always be what's right. There's a difference between the way I prefer things to be and the quote-unquote right way for things to be. And the speaker was talking about just something as simple as loading the dishwasher. He said that he preferred that the dishwasher be loaded a specific way, and I think I'm that way. I like, my order in the dishwasher. I have that, certain spot for the glasses, a certain spot for the coffee mugs, a certain spot for the small dishes and the bowls and the large plates and the silverware. I need to be a little bit flexible because that might not be the only quote-unquote right way to load the dishwasher. So flexibility is allowing different options and different preferences than my own to exist within the context of my marriage. Adaptability is similar to flexibility, but not quite, because to adapt means that I'm able to change in response to a stimulus. So in response to my spouse and I both working from home, in response to my children being homeschooled during a time of crisis, in response to a quarantine, as a marriage, we are able to adapt in a way that allows us to function better. So adaptability is important. Plasticity is important, and plasticity actually refers to the ability to learn new things, to understand new concepts, to practice new ways of engagement, new ways of being. And our neurons at the level of our brains are very, very plastic. We have neuroplasticity. So if we practice something, it can actually grow stronger and we can get better at it. And that's hopeful news for us because we don't have to be frustrated if we feel like we're not achieving the level of marital bliss or the perfect sort of environment in our homes that we want. We will get better as we practice these things. In times of stress, it's very important to keep lines of communication open. Our spouses are meant to support us. Spouses are meant to support one another, but they cannot read each other's minds. So when one is stressed, when one is distraught, when one is frustrated or angry or sad or anxious, it's really important that there be a line of communication with the other, because there's a lovely saying that shared joy is double joy and shared sorrow is half sorrow. Our spouses are there to help us cope, but they can only do so when we communicate with one another. Balance. And balance is very important, especially at a time when we're not able to do all of the things that we usually do to maintain balance. So trying to keep our routine varied and to keep our marriage stimulated with different things during the week. Patience is hugely important in times of stress. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ. And so being able to find refuge, to find help in patience and in prayer is a part of the Islamic prescription during times of stress. Forgiveness. And forgiveness is another actually variable that researchers have found can lead to marital satisfaction. It's an important predictor of marital satisfaction. And lastly, humility, realizing that all of us are dealing with a lot. Some of us have the preoccupation always in the back of our mind that someone in our family could get ill. Maybe someone in our family is ill. Maybe we're worried about their health. Maybe we're every moment trying to check ourselves to have that extra bit of tawakkul on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're engaging in a struggle with ourselves to stay calm. So to know that we're not all acting at our absolute best. We may slip. We may make mistakes. And to be humble in knowing that I might make mistakes and to be forgiving in knowing that those around me might make mistakes is a great source of comfort and really goes a long way in a marriage in times of stress. I want to close with this concept. A garden abandoned will not flourish. Now, earlier in the presentation, I showed a picture of a beautiful garden, and I said this garden was in Victoria, Canada, and it's just a beautiful place. This is actually what the garden looked like initially. The garden dries up when we don't pay attention to the kinds of nourishment that it needs. When our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together diminishes, when our communication diminishes, when we only see the negative in one another, when there's an emotional or a psychological disconnect, we might start finding excuses not to be with one another, so our physical connection dries up. Intimacy at all levels, emotional, physical, all of that diminishes. And so I like to close with this verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the earth is dry and lifeless, but when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the waters upon it, it's able to produce every kind of lovely plant. And I meant to have that other slide here because this is actually the original limestone pit that became the gardens that I showed you all. Those gardens are in Victoria, Canada. They're called the Butchart Gardens. And they were the product actually of a woman named Jenny Butchart. And Jenny's husband was an entrepreneur, and he moved to Victoria because he recognized that there was an abundance of limestone, and he was in the cement business. And limestone was an important component of cement. And so she told her husband, after you've cleared out these quarries and they're empty and you no longer need what's in them, you can see here actually, this is the limestone, the quarry where they would get the stone, and this is the cement factory. She said, leave the pit that's left to me. I'd like to turn it into a garden. You can see the chimney, the tower here from the cement factory. This is the same tower. This is a picture from the Butchart Gardens, and you can see that even after it was lifeless, just rock, dry, nothing really there, barren, with care and nourishment and cultivation, it became one of the most famous gardens in North America. The gardens now cover 55 acres. They're visited by over 1 million people every year. They're absolutely beautiful. I had the opportunity to go there 10 years ago when we were not in quarantine, obviously. And they are gorgeous. They are beautiful, beautiful places. They make you feel like you're in a piece of Jannah. And you just walk around and you say, SubhanAllah, this is so amazing. And so I always like to close with this example because sometimes we get to a point in our marriages where we feel like, there's no hope, where we feel like everything has dried up. But we need to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us throughout the Quran that He can bring life to that which is dead, to that which has died. That water is an amazing source of life. And when it comes down on the dead earth, we find that plants come to life, that things spring out from the dead earth. And so to always remember that there's always hope, and there are professionals in the field of marriage and family therapy, in the field of family counseling, in the field of individual and couples therapy, and that we should utilize that if we feel that our marriage can benefit from it. Even in these days, we are able to access some of those resources using teleconferencing and telemedicine. And so there should never, we should not give up hope, inshallah, in our marriages. This is the picture that I started with, and I'd like to just thank the Islamic Center of San Diego for allowing us to have this virtual halaqah about how to make our marriages and interpersonal relationships stronger and more nourished during times of stress. We went a little bit over our 30 minutes today, but I appreciate everyone for staying with us and for contributing to this virtual space where we can hold these important events. I'd like to close by praying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us seek out the nourishment that our specific marriages need during this time, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability in these last few days of Sha'ban to prepare not only at the individual level, but collectively as a married couple and collectively as a family for the beautiful gift that is Ramadan. I'd also like to just give a closing piece of advice that in the month of Sha'ban, oftentimes we're sort of easily distracted because we're going into Ramadan. Ramadan is a time of focus, but often in the last few days of Sha'ban, we can get easily distracted. We don't have to show up to every argument to which we are invited. We don't have to get pulled off that path by every distraction. We can stay focused, and we can stay focused as a collective. We can stay focused as a couple, as a family, on these last few days of Sha'ban and on the pending days of Ramadan, so that we can really get the most benefit from them. And so with that, I will close. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. I pray that this was of benefit to all of you. It was certainly beneficial as a reminder for myself. Any good that comes of this really is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and any mistakes are my own, and I seek refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from reminding other people of something but forgetting those things myself. So may we all, inshallah, stay on this path, journey step by step, and help nourish our relationships, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.